I'm very excited about being here this morning. I was excited before I got in my car and drove down here. I got even more excited when I got here. I'm used to being greeted with warm smiles and open arms, but the people that I met here today greeted me with the open fullness of their hearts. That's very unusual. When that happens to me, I know I'm in a special place. So I'm extremely excited to be here, and I recognize I'm going to be challenged. So, I had originally intended to challenge you, but it looks like it's going to be the other way around, and I'm grateful for that blessing. I'm here to talk about consciousness. I do a lot of things. I wear a lot of different hats. One of the things that I do, I'm an attorney. I practice family law. So on the left side of my brain, I work with very practical, real, difficult problems. I also am a consciousness coach. And so I work with people in developing their spiritual growth. And that's very much a heart and right brain type of endeavor. But I try and bring the two together, and they complement each other in a lot of ways. One of the things that I bring to consciousness and the growth of spirit is some practicality. Because it's wonderful to talk about these things, but so many people say, I'm really moved by that, but how do I do it? What is the practical mechanics of doing that? So that's what I try and focus on. One of the things I want to point out, because y'all may start laughing as we go through this, but what you've already heard today, we did not coordinate. Okay, this is how God and Spirit works. We did not coordinate. Everybody came independently with what they were going to talk about, and the song today that we heard is I Am the Place Where God Shows Up. You're going to see how that figures into what I'm going to talk about. The meditation message, he talked about unexpected income. That too is going to be a part of what I talk about. So I'm finding that y'all have already set the stage for me in what I'm going to talk about. It's just Spirit working the way it does. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is living as the higher self. How do we do that? How do we? I suspect probably everybody in this room at some point or another has had that feeling of wanting their life to have meaning and purpose, of wanting to be the most that they can be, of wanting to do something special, something that's important to them in the way that they define importanceness. Abraham Maslow, he was a psychologist. You're probably familiar with him. All the psychologists of his day were studying mental illness and what's wrong with the mind and how things go off the track. And he said, I want to study healthy people, people that are doing well, people that are really getting a lot out of life. What are the common threads? And he looked at a lot of those things, and he made some very interesting discoveries. But one of the things that he talked about is a human being that is not living to their full potential will feel a sense of restlessness and discontent. Something's missing, something's not right. There should be more in my life than what there is. And so part of living as our higher self is trying to figure out this puzzle, who am I, and what are all the parts of me, and bringing them all together so that the totality of our being is functioning in congruence. And when we do that, then we can live as and be our higher selves. When people ask me this question, how do I live as my higher self? The answer to that question could take days. There's so much information. We've learned so much about consciousness and how it works and how to scale that mountain. But because I've only got about 20 to 25 minutes, I'm going to have to give you a very abbreviated version. And the very abbreviated version, if you want to get right at the fulcrum of what we're talking about here, it's a matter of transcending the ego. And I like to talk about the ego kind of humorously because it can be very entertaining at times, sometimes problematic, but it can also be entertaining. But I like to refer to it as the chimp, the inner chimpanzee that we all have. It's that animal nature that comes with these bodies that we drive. It's woven into the fabric of these physical entities that we maneuver around and execute our daily activities with. It's in our flesh. It's in our bones. It's in our blood. And so the simple answer to how do I live as my higher self is, 1, lose the chimp, and 2, live in love. There's a story about how people would trap chimpanzees, which is they'd take a big jar with a hole just big enough for a chimp to get its hand in, and they'd chain it to a tree, and they'd put a banana inside that jar. Well, the chimp, being the animal that he is, thought, aha, banana, I want that. Banana tastes good. So he'd stick his hand in that jar and grab that banana. Well, when he made a fist and he had that banana in his hand would not come out of the jar. And he would hang on to that banana and try and get it out of the jar and try and get it out of the jar, and he couldn't get it out of the jar. Never thought to just drop the banana and pull his hand back out. He had to have that banana. Meanwhile, the bushman comes up behind him and clubs him in the back of the head. That's kind of how the ego is. It gets focused on a banana, and it locks on that banana, and it won't let go. And many times that results in a club to the back of the head. No fun. If you've never tried it, I don't recommend it. It's no fun. So I want to talk about a couple of examples of bananas, just to kind of give you an idea of the chimp in action. One banana, self-interest. The chimp, our animal nature, our survival instinct is to take care of ourselves, pursue our self-interest, keep ourselves safe, secure, have the things that we need. And there was a discussion one time. This couple, older couple, had spent a lot of time and a lot of years amassing this beautiful art collection. They had pieces from all around the world, and they all came together beautifully as a collection. And they had a very palatial home, had them displayed in their home. And this couple, their 2 daughters, one day after lunch, the conversation somehow turned to these pictures, and the daughters were looking around. And they said, "When y'all die, we can sell these, can't we?" Mom, without skipping a beat, said, "If you own them." So here's the chimp going after what it wants, going after its self-interest, money, security, all those things I want. I'm not really interested in the art, but I see something I do want. But the chimp was unaware and didn't pay attention to and didn't account for Mom and Dad's feelings. This thing that they'd invested their lives in that was so important to them, and you want to take it down to the dollar store and sell it and get 25 cents on the dollar. Chimp is blind to those kinds of things. It does not have the wider perspective. Very narrowed focus. If you're in a fight or flight situation, chimp's a pretty good animal to pull out of your pocket. But in regular dealing with human beings, not very effective. Causes problems. Another example of a banana. Vanity. There was a young cowboy. He just bought a new ranch, and he was all the rage amongst the ladies. They thought he was really hot stuff. He had a party over and had several people come over to his new ranch. He had some new cows, and he knew quite a few of these people, some of them pretty well, some of them not so well. But there was a nice crowd gathered, and so he was walking and giving them a tour of the ranch, and his ego was a little inflated. And he saw a young lady that he kind of had an interest in, had an eye for. And so they walk up past this pasture where he's got some cattle. And they all kind of stop to look at his new cattle that he's just purchased. And they notice that there's this bull and this cow. And this bull walks up to this cow, kind of saunters over, being the cool animal that he is, and looks at her. And the cow looks up and kind of gets that deer in the headlights look. And that bull walks up and starts rubbing noses with her. And it looks like these 2 cows are kissing. So this cowboy, being completely full of himself, looks over at this cute little young lady who's watching this go on with the cows, and he says, "That looks like fun, doesn't it?" The lady turned her eyes and looked at him and said, "Well, it's your cow." So here again we have chimp out of control doing what it does, but it's kind of blind to how others are perceiving it. It's kind of blind to the bigger picture. It gets focused in chimp mode. And when we do that, when the ego is driving the ship, frequently we do things that aren't so helpful, oftentimes hurt us, sometimes are downright very, very destructive. Living as the higher self is being able to step out of chimp mode and look at the bigger picture. If you want to transcend the chimp, how do we do that? How do we get out of the ego? It's problematic because, as I've said, the chimp is woven into our flesh and blood. It's a part of what we are. It automatically comes with the body that you get and you drive. And it operates automatically, whether you turn it on or not. That chimp is always in the background doing his thing. And what's really scary is when the chimp is driving the ship and we don't even realize it. That's usually where we get in the most trouble. And the chimp is a sneaky animal because he hides in the background. A lot of people think, I've got my chimp under control. I've got a nice little box that he lives in, and I let him out when it's appropriate, and he stays in the rest of the time. Frequently not that way. He's frequently out roaming around the ship. We don't even know it. As a consciousness coach, I have some exercises that I've developed in people that I work with. And what I try and do, kind of the short and simple of it is I try and accelerate people's spiritual evolution. And a lot of times that requires provocation. That requires making them confront parts of themselves they don't necessarily want to confront, making them have that soul to chimp conversation. So I developed some exercises to help smoke out the chimp so that he could be brought in front of the person and they could look at him and look at how he was operating within them. And it's amazing to me and kind of surprising and also entertaining, people that think they don't have a chimp problem at all, they pull out some of these exercises and they start doing them and they say, oh my gosh, I had no idea. One example, getting in an argument with something over something that's pretty important to you, where you know you're right. No question about it. You know you're right and they're in error. And right in the middle of that conversation, stop and say, you know what, I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I was looking at that wrong. See how easy that is to do? When you try it, that chimp comes running. Argument, my banana. And it'll give you all kinds of reasons as to why you shouldn't do that. Well, if you admit something's not true that is true, then you're going to be lying. You're going to be setting a bad example. You're going to hurt somebody. You're going to make them operate on false information. It'll give you all kinds of reasons and excuses why you can't do that, why you can't lay down and roll over. Because the chimp wants to win. The chimp wants to be right. So I had people do some of these things, and I would challenge them to attempt some of these things. And what frequently would happen is exactly what was spoken about. Many times there was unexpected income. And I'm going to talk about a couple of these examples. A lady named Desiree, she was having a lot of tension with her son. He was getting to be in his early teens, and he was kind of, feeling that I got to be macho thing, and I've got to stand up to authority, and I've got to set my own rules, and I've got to lay my own course. And so they were starting to have some conflict over this. And she did the thing that I just said try and do. They were in the middle of an argument. She knew she was right because she was the mother, and because experience had told her that the way she was viewing it was correct and the way he was looking at it was not necessarily the wisest approach. And she thought about this and she said, you know what, I'm going to try it. So she did. Right in the middle of it, she stopped. She said, you know what, you're right. I hadn't looked at it that way. You're right. I'm sorry. She said it was the weirdest thing she'd ever seen. He immediately stopped. He had no idea what to do with this. His entire demeanor changed. And she said, looking back, what I realized happened is in that moment, he realized that he was more important to me than my pride. And he felt love. She said it changed the entire course of our interactions after that. She said we could have discussions about the facts and what was smart and what wasn't smart, and it didn't become a power battle. She said it had amazing effect. Another example that I had, there was a friend of mine that I was working with, and I had talked with her about one thing or another and challenged her to try some of these things about when the chimp comes up, just step aside. And so she was at a recruiting campaign where there was a big company. They invited a lot of people. They were looking for a limited number of positions. So they basically kind of had a job fair, said, all y'all come, and a bunch of people showed up. And there was an opportunity to mingle with representatives of this company. And in the middle of this, as all this was going on, she was talking about something, and the guy next to her said, "That's completely wrong." He said, that's stupid that you're seeing it that way. That goes against everything. Well, she realized that this guy was kind of looking for a fight, and she thought about the chimp, and she thought about, okay, how do I not respond in chimp mode? And she just said, well, okay. And went on with another part of the conversation. Didn't respond to it, didn't acknowledge it, didn't fight with it, put her chimp back in the box and went on. Well, in her mind, she was very worried that she was going to look like an idiot. And the chimp never wants to look like a fool. So that was her concern. She was going to be made a fool of, but she went ahead and she did this. Here's the unexpected income to her. Later that evening, a person from the company walked up and said, I saw the way you responded to that guy. She said, you handled him with such diplomacy, grace, and poise. My hat is off to you. I respect you for that. They hired her. Okay? So time and time again, we see these unexpected incomes that come from stepping out of chimp mode and operating from the higher self. The process of stepping back, stepping out of the very constricted focus of the chimp. It's a lot like the three blind men and the elephant. You've all heard that story, right? Where three blind men walk up and one of them grabs the elephant's tail and he said, "This feels like a rope. We must have walked under a tent." The other blind man walked up to the side of the elephant and he felt and he said, "No, this feels like a wall. We've walked into a building." And then the third one walks up and he hit the elephant's leg and he felt it and he said, "No, this feels like a tree trunk. We're in the forest." So these three blind guys argue for 20 minutes over whether they're in a tent at a building or in the forest and cannot figure it out. Until finally, the fourth blind guy, who's been listening to what each of them said, "The only thing I know of that fits all those things is an elephant." He saw it because he stepped back and he looked at the bigger picture. The same is true in life, and I've seen this again and again and again. Within the mind, because we are very complex creatures, most of us have many, many parts of who we are. And part of living as the higher self is stepping out of each of those parts and seeing the bigger picture and looking at the entire group of identities and needs within ourselves and saying, okay, I recognize you, I recognize you, I recognize you, I recognize you, and I embrace all of you. Now, what can we do with the choir? Because until people have stepped back and started looking from that bigger picture, all these agendas are in conflict with each other. You see it again and again and again. Sometimes it manifests as hypocrisy. It's not intended to be, but when there's two competing agendas and the person doesn't recognize they're simultaneously operating in their psyche, there's a lot of conflict. And it eats up a lot of energy. And it makes us much less efficient in how we operate. But when we step back and we put the entire choir together and it starts singing in coherence, then we have a powerful being. Now, we get to the practical question of how do we do this? How do we step out of the narrow focus, step out of the chimp, and how do we start looking from the big picture? Well, consciousness is a spectrum, and I could talk for days and days about this, but the simple version of it is, when we're born as a child, we're born with the simplest configuration of consciousness that we experience as human beings, which is the single point of identity of ego. A baby, all it knows is what it wants, has no comprehension from the environment that it's operating in or how what it does impacts the environment, has no comprehension of other people and what they're thinking and feeling. All it knows is me, 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 me. I'm hungry, feed me. My diaper's wet, change me. Give me what I want and give it to me now. As we grow and evolve, consciousness expands. So I'm going to give this to you in a very simplistic, crude way of looking at it, but it explains the point. When the child gets a little bit older, and his consciousness develops some, it starts to realize, if I bite mommy's finger, mommy's going to be mad at me. So it begins to realize it has a connection with its environment, and what it does impacts its environment. And then it gets a little more sophisticated, and its consciousness expands a little more, and it realizes, hey, if I'm out on the playground and I call this kid a bad name, they may not like me because I don't like it when I get called a bad name. Well, in very simple terms, their consciousness has just doubled, because now they're processing reality from their own perspective and the perspective of the target of their actions. When they grow and they get a little more evolved, they realize, if I'm at school and I punch this kid in the nose, this other kid may see me do it and may not like me. Okay, in very simple terms, their consciousness has just tripled, because now they're processing reality from their perspective, the perspective of the target of their actions, and the perspective of a neutral third-party observer. So this is how consciousness grows as it evolves. The scope of perspectives that it's able to juggle and that it takes into account and that it values grows larger and larger and larger until it reaches universal consciousness. And at universal consciousness, theoretically, for that consciousness, every perspective that exists holds value. Every perspective. There's an old saying, the simpleton's concern is for himself. The citizen's concern is for his community. The patriot's concern is for his country. And the saint's concern is for all of humanity. Well, that's talking about consciousness at different stages of evolution as it grows and expands. Now, how do we encourage our consciousness to do that? One thing that's very helpful is, and we're fortunate in this day and age, we've brought together a lot of information on consciousness. And when you compare schools of thought on consciousness, and there are many, many, they've shown up in religion, they've shown up in philosophy, they've shown up in psychology, they've shown up in esoteric work, all the way back to 4,000 years ago, and probably well before that, but that's our first written recordings of it. When you look at all these cultures that have compared consciousness, they have all described similar landmarks in that road of evolution. There's remarkable universality in their descriptions. So we see the spectrum as we transition from the single point of ego all the way up to universal consciousness. We see these landmarks along that road. For simplicity's sake, I say there's 7 levels of consciousness. That's an arbitrary division, but it's a good number for working with and trying to conceptualize this transition of growth and expansion. So if you have that map of consciousness, it really helps you in growing, because it kind of gives you an idea of where you sit and where you are and where you want to go. So having a map is one tool that is extremely useful. Meditation is an extremely useful tool. Meditation has been the one thing that, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but meditation is the one practice that has almost universally been shown to increase conscious coherence. Very helpful practice. And then the third thing, and then I will just about be out of time, but I've spent a lot of time studying consciousness, and I have read a whole lot of stuff, and I've looked at it from many, many, many different angles. You could even say the practice of law is a study in consciousness, where when you're in court, you're looking at the interaction of individual consciousness with the corporate or collective consciousness of the state or the country, whichever the case may be. But I've looked at it from many, many, many different angles, and there are 21 things that keep coming up time and time and time again as being, you might say, mental skills, you might say spiritual skills, you might say emotional skills, but they are skills of the mind. And we see them talked about time and time again, that if you master these skills, it will push your consciousness upward. And I'll real quickly, I will run through what those 21 are. Probably none of these will be a surprise to you. Like I said, they're kind of universal touchstones. 1, honesty, egalitarianism, equanimity, faith, responsibility, balance, empathy, non-judgmentalism, open-mindedness, presentness, courage, appreciation, love, emotional discipline, mental discipline, flexibility, positiveness, assertiveness, objectivity, communication, and awareness. If you will look at people who are functioning at very high levels of consciousness, what you will see is they're pretty skilled in all those traits. And when you see people who are floundering around in the shallows, in the mud pits of consciousness, they're usually challenged by most of those. So having this checklist is a very useful tool of going through and doing a very systematic way of growing your consciousness, of expanding your consciousness, and of elevating your consciousness. The tried and true historical way is you wander through life till you have a challenging experience, and then that challenging experience makes you stop and look at yourself and how you're interacting with life. And if you're lucky, it will trigger you to evolve. Or it could send you on a downward spiral. Sometimes it does that. But traditionally, that's how it's been done. But we've got enough information now, we've got good enough maps, that if somebody has the motivation and they want to do it, you can take this checklist and say, I want to grow here, 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 and here, and I see this is the area where I'm having the biggest challenge and weakness. I need to focus some time on that. Very pragmatic approach. Ben Franklin, he thought to himself that there were 13 virtues that really defined a person, and that if he could inculcate those virtues in himself, that he would become a virtuous man. And so what he did is he made a list of 13 virtues, and he made a chart. And 1 week he would focus really hard on growing in one of those virtues. And then the next week he would move to the next. And as he was working on each one, each time he had a lapse, he'd put a little check mark. So he kept track of where he had been and how many lapses he had found. And what he found was if you try and do all of it at once, it's too much. But if you break it down and you take it piece by piece and you focus some intense effort on one piece for a while, you make progress. And so what he saw himself doing was on each one, he would make a lot of progress during the week that he was working on it. And then when he was working on the others, he would backslide a little bit, but he would maintain some of the progress that he had made. Until eventually, after several years, he was able to cycle through his entire 13 virtues and have very few lapses. And he believed that that was one of the main things that resulted in his success. You can take the same kind of pragmatic approach with these 21 indices of consciousness, and if you're the type that's inclined to do it, you can systematically push yourself forward and up the chain of evolution. Thank you very much for letting me speak today. It has been an honor and a pleasure to get to talk to you today.